Hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to use my birthday to be with you guys and in Skálholt and doing research in ecotheology, which is my passion. And I have to tell you beforehand that this paper that I'm going to present today, it is not finished. And I am an intuitive writer. I always need to write my papers and then again and again until they become articles. And so I'm still in the process. And it's therefore that I'm courageous enough to bring you a project which is in process, because I know that you know so much about ecumenism. And so I'm so excited to present it to you and to get feedback. And I've cut it down very strictly in order to give space for discussions, because I need some feedback from you. You will have to write my paper. Will you? Every noon at 12, in the blazing heat, God comes to me in the form of 200 grams of gruel. I know him in every grain. I taste him in every lick. I commune with him as I gulp, for he keeps me alive with 200 grams of gruel. Written by an unknown woman in a famine-stricken area in India, this poem speaks about the experience of abundant divine presence in the context of lack. The poem reflects on tasting God, knowing God in every grain, and tasting God in every lick. Ecological theology shares with economics a worldview where resources are limited and where scarcity is a mode of shared human existence. Scarcity, then, marks the human predicament in a world of limited natural resources, in which humans can no longer choose between theological abundance and economical scarcity, because only the economically privileged have the luxury to do so. Sally McFaig argues that ecologically responsible economics begins with sustainability and distributive justice. Will you give us a new one? It begins with sustainability and distributive justice, not with the allocation of resources among competing individuals. End of quote. As such, the goal of ecological theology cannot be abundance and endless growth for everyone, but rather to seek that everyone have enough to survive. The abundance that I am advocating here is thus not diametrical opposite of scarcity, but rather a divine potentiality within limited resources. What kind of Christian practices evoke frugality as an ecological household virtue? How can the ecumenical thirst for fellowship of all believers inspire ecological justice? Willis Jenkins argues that the Church must face the dire consequence of climate change. It must learn to live with the damages that already have been made and adapt its teaching to this new and challenging reality. And Jenkins writes, let me see. Yeah, Jenkins is here. The ideas of sustainability and social justice starts from acknowledgement that our ways of life are already remaking the world, and ask, what are we now sustaining? Can we learn to sustain whatever beauty, justice, love, wildness, truth, wealth, otherness, and sacredness sustain the human spirit? Can we sustain the practices that teach and transform us? End of quote. In what way do our practices already remake the world? Such an inquiry teaches us to seek and respect sustenance in that which already nourishes us. This paper looks for such an ecumenical inspiration in the Eucharist, in the Lord's Supper, or more specifically, in the practices around the Eucharist, the response to abundance and scarcity in relation to bread and wine. Much has been written and argued about the different practices of disposing of the Eucharistic elements, which in turn reveal the metaphysical premises and attitudes towards divine presence. Is there anything to be learned from those heated debates of what to do with lack and leftovers? Is there something in these old habits that can teach and transform us? Something that can contribute to frugal living on earth? The paper answers this question in the affirmative. It reflects on the Eucharistic practices in the Lutheran North and views these practices through an eco-theological lens. What do we do when we lack bread and wine? What shall we do with the leftovers? The answer is varied in the Lutheran churches, and the different practices reveal the different theological and metaphysical views to what happens in and after the Eucharist, how the divine presence is mediated through bread and wine, and how long the infinite presents itself in the finite elements. By pointing to these different practices, my aim is not to treat one tradition, namely my own, which is Lutheran, as the best or the most liturgically appropriate for estimating ethical questions on abundance and scarcity, or even to present the Lutheran praxis as a unified whole. No, my point is rather to cast experience into play with tradition, sacred text, and doctrine in a hermeneutical spiral. And this is done by drawing on practices in one location, namely West Nordic Lutheran traditions, and lift them up as a resource for responsible household practices. So it's more the idea of picking up one tradition for inspiration for ecological theology, which is my project here. And a new one. The notion of the household, oikos, of God, has become a new theological root metaphor for theological studies. The modern term of the economical, the ecumenical, and the ecological, they all stem from the ancient Greek verb oikein, to dwell, and house, oikos. They point to an ancient household rule in search for contemporary economic justice, ecological sustainability, and ecumenical fellowship. MacFaig puts the three rules of this house succinctly: to take only your share, clean up after yourselves, and keep the house in good repair for the future occupants. End of quote. Ernst M. Conradie maintains that the root metaphor of the house offers strong resources for theological reflection, for example, in relation to stewardship, eco-justice, hospitality, and eschatological hope, that our homes will become God's home. However, Conradie contends that because of the household metaphor can have so many different referents and contexts, and the houses ranges from the Christian family to the local church to the ecumenical church to the management rules of the global village and to the entire biosphere, the metaphor of the oikos can lead to confusion. But insofar as one is looking for an inspiration in the poetical, the ambivalent and mystical vocabularies of liturgical practice, the present paper finds this flexibility of the root term and applicability to different signifiers, from church to biosphere, to be a strength rather than weakness. If some of the most promising spirals of interpreting texts and doctrines in contemporary theology go through the different parameters of ecumenical and ecological perspectives, it seems helpful to use metaphors that are applicable to both houses, the ecclesiological and the ecospheric. Conradie points out that the self-productive quality of the larger ecosystem does not quite fit with the static domestic metaphors of stability and protective boundaries included in the human habitat. It seems that the theological root metaphor of the oikos, the house, creates its own apophatical impossibilities. It slides between reference from the local congregation to the ecosphere. It resembles a house, a home, a habitat. It opens its own exclusions and inclusions, and yet it is not this nor that. Interestingly, when it comes to Martin Luther's take on the divine presence in the Eucharist, we also meet something that resembles an apophatic reluctance to distinguish too sharply between the divine and the daily bread. For Luther, bread and wine are capable of divine presence, and this presence is not only for him symbolic, but also physical. But when it comes to explaining how this miracle happens and how long it lasts, Luther remains silent and he refuses to answer. He distrusts both the Roman Aristotelian metaphysics of substance and accidents, and also the symbolic and humanistic approach of the more radical reformers. The Lutheran understanding of the real presence in the sacrament differs thus both from the Catholic and Reformed understandings. The 10th paragraph of the Confessio Augustana puts this principle succinctly: it is taught among us that the true body and blood of Christ are really present in the supper of our Lord under the form of bread and wine, and are therefore distributed and received. Is this here? Since the substantiation doctrine teaches a complete change in substance, the question never rises about the essence of the bread and wine after the service. It never changes back into that which it once was. For the Lutheran, the question of the leftovers become more complex. Lutheran and Reformed theologians met in Wittenberg in 1539 and signed the Wittenberg Concord to try to resolve among themselves the issues of real presence. The Wittenberg Concord postulates the question of real presence as: nothing has the character of a sacrament apart from the use instituted by Christ. And this formulation was intended to sharpen the Lutheran view that it is Christ that gives the sacrament in consecration, distribution, and reception. Luther allowed pastors to take the sacrament to the sick after the service, and he viewed the action, usus, not only as the distribution in the service, but also the distribution of the sacrament to the sick after the service. And one of the table talks have him saying, one is engaged in the action, usus, even if it extends for an hour or two, or even if one carries it to another altar or across the street, it is and remains the body of Christ. End of quote. In 1543, Luther wrote a letter to the pastor Simon Wolferinus in the St. Andrew's Church in Eisleben. Wolferinus had argued that the sacraments were no longer sacraments after the service. In his letter, Luther exhorts Wolferinus to eat and drink the leftovers after the service to make sure that there would be no uncertainties among the people about the Eucharist and Christ's real presence. The formula of the Concord, written in 1577 after the death of Luther, uses the formula in usu non extra usum to explain that the presence of Christ in the service, but not after the service. By this formulation, the authors of the formula tried to bring the different positions of Luther and Melanchthon into union to safeguard the real presence, as well as Melanchthon's more humanistic focus. But turning to the liturgical history of the West Nordic countries, which is the country where I was born, Iceland, and the country where I live, in Norway, the church ordinance of King Christian III from 1537 became a founding constitution for the Danish, the Icelandic, Faroese, and Norwegian churches in the time in and after the Reformation. The ordinance describes the Eucharistic economic practices in this manner. If someone wants to commune, the pastor prepares as much bread and wine as suitable for the number of communicants. And the pastors shall carefully notice how many shall receive communion, so that it does not become necessary to consecrate twice. End of quote. The ordinance thus answers the economic questions about scarcity and abundance of bread and wine by focusing on preparation and accurate consecration and distribution. When the Book of Concord was brought to Denmark, King Frederick II refused to accept it. The Concord formula and its Eucharistic precisions on in usu non extra usum was therefore not accepted as confessional literature in these parts of the Lutheran world. Knowing exactly how many would come to communion was relatively easy during the time when the Eucharist was closely linked to the rite of penance. This connection between the Eucharist and penance became stronger with increased church power in moral matters in the 17th and 18th centuries. I must apologize for my voice, or lack thereof. Helge Fehn argues, from the standpoint of the Norwegian Church, that the great theological changes in these decades, which was partly, now I'm jumping to the 19th century, that there was a big change there from the old tradition of being very occupied with real presence to a newer Eucharistic understanding. And this new Eucharistic understanding at the end of the 19th century, both in Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, was much less interested in real presence than before. In Fehn's view, this new understanding had consequences for the way in which the Church now treated Eucharistic abundance and scarcity. For Fehn, this new Eucharistic shift crystallizes the royal decree in 1914 for Norway, which allowed individual cups for communion. If the ordinance and rituals of the 16th and 17th century had focused on frugality and distribution, the wine now flows abundant in the 20th century, and there is no possibility to drink up from all the individual cups. The Norwegian altar book from 1992 says that the leftovers should be disposed of in a respectable manner, but no specification of the manner is provided. The newest Norwegian church ritual from 2011 has taken up the in usu understanding explicitly into the rubrics and says, according to Lutheran understanding, one should only view the bread and wine as Jesus' body and blood in relation to the Eucharist itself. But out of respect for the holy ritual, the leftovers shall be treated in a respectful manner, since during some time these elements have been bearers of Jesus' body and blood. End of quote. Thus, the understanding of the duration of the divine presence in the sacraments seems to have changed a lot in the Norwegian Church in the last 2 centuries. And meanwhile, in the Icelandic general rubrics of 2013, they exhort the pastors to eat and drink the leftovers after the service, but allowing for storing the bread in a pyx. And what does all of this have to do with ecology? Why is it important to have practices that can be an inspiration for ecological practice? In 1978, the Lutheran World Federation and the Roman Catholic Church signed a document on the Eucharist. And this document proposes that Catholics pay attention to the origin of the practice of preserving the wine and the bread, and it was to give them to the sick and to those who could not be present. In this document, it contains an advice to the Lutherans that the best means should be adopted of showing respect due to the elements that have served for the celebration of the Eucharist, which is to consume them consequently without precluding their use for communion of the sick. End of quote. The new document between Roman Catholics and Lutherans commemorating the 500-year Reformation anniversary concludes that awareness is dawning on Lutherans and Catholics that the struggle of the 16th century is over. The reasons for mutually condemning each other's faith have fallen by the wayside. If the Roman Catholic and Lutheran churches are moving from struggle to deeper understanding and respect for that which unites and distinguishes each tradition, one might hope and suggest that the different Eucharistic processes provide potential resources for fellowship and ecological justice at the age of climate change. If Catholics are exhorted to remember the original intention of saving the elements for the sick, thank you. Sven Erik Brott takes this point further in the context of the Lutheran Church of Sweden. He argues that the communion of the sick after the service should be a basic principle in the praxis of preserving the Eucharistic elements, and those who will receive after the service should be mentioned in the prayers of the people in the service. By focusing on the reservation of the elements after the service for the sick, Brott points to the diaconal element of the Eucharist. The diaconal fits in as an ecumenical Eucharistic household rule which stresses inclusion, fellowship, and distributive justice at the age of climate change. Likewise, when the document on the Eucharist exhorts the Lutherans to treat the Eucharistic elements with respect, this reads as an ecological household rule that emphasizes the respect for daily and for divine food in a world which starves for both kinds of consumption. Saving food, taking care of food, distributing food equally, taking care of taking exactly what we need and nothing more, tasting God in every lick. These are solid household principles in the ecumenacy of the ecosphere. And it doesn't matter which house we are referring to. The principle fits in both oikos. Gordon Lathrop argues that a strong Eucharistic practice needs to flow into a strong love of meals and strong truth about their presence. Lathrop, he refers to Eucharistic economies, and he stresses a correlation between the distribution and sharing of food in the Eucharist and the way in which we distribute and share all our other meals. And Lathrop maintains that the question about which elements are appropriate to serve as Eucharistic food is a part of this Eucharistic economics, especially in areas where wheat and grape wine are not available. Lathrop distinguishes between the universal and the local economies of the Eucharist and maintains that both can be supported by Christological arguments. The universal character of the Eucharist insists on wheat, bread, and grape wine, and stresses the importance of symbolic unity from one place to another. The local and contextual character of the Eucharist focuses more on the means that are at hand and are local to the area where the Eucharist shall take place. Such insistence on Eucharistic economies are pertinent to our context here in Skálholt, in a country in which grapes and wheat are rare commodities. Bishop Páll Jónsson was the 7th bishop of Skálholt, and he lived in the beginning of the 13th century. And his stone coffin, skeleton, and crosier are kept in the basement of Skálholt Cathedral. If we have time, we can perhaps see it. The saga of Bishop Paul, written shortly after his death, recounts a visit to Skálholt from Bishop Jón of Greenland. And in this story, Bishop Jón offers to teach Bishop Paul how to brew altar wine from crowberries, which are local to both countries. The brewing of the crowberry wine went very well, according to the saga, and the Icelandic annals in 1203 indicate that wine made out of berries was brewed in Iceland for the first time that very year. However, next summer there were no crowberries found in the entire island. It was a tough spring. Some years after the crowberry brewing enterprise in Skálholt between the two bishops, Archbishop Sigurd in Niðaros wrote to the Pope in Rome and asked permission to use some other kind of grain than wheat and some other kind of brew instead of grape wine, ale, for example. The reason that the Archbishop gave was that the people in some parishes were poor, there was a shortage, and wine and wheat did not grow there. The answer from Rome came in 1237, where the Pope rejected any altar wine not made out of grapes and any bread not made from wheat. The economic lack, which is told in these stories, reveal how difficult it was to uphold the universal symbolism of the Eucharist in the north. Likewise, the saga of Eric the Red from the 13th century recounts the discovery of Wineland the Good, southwest of Greenland. Not surprisingly, this utopic new and unknown land is described in the saga as the place of Eucharistic abundance. When the Icelandic explorers of Wineland sail upriver into the land, the description is both succinct and also idyllic. They found self-sown wheat fields on the land there, wherever there were hollows, and wherever there was hilly ground, there were wines. There were self-sown wheat and wine. The Icelandic 13th century description of Wineland the Good describes the good life as living inside the perpetual, abundant, self-producing, sustainable Eucharist. In the beginning of this paper, I proposed an unknown and starving Indian woman as a figure of scarcity and abundance within the conditions of scarcity. In the section where we went into Lutheran leftover praxis, I posited the different advices given to Catholics and Lutherans on the communion of the sick and the reservation of the sacrament as ecumenical household principles, ecumenical and ecological, in the context of scarcity in the age of climate change. And I have now, at the end of my talk, drawn up two different geographical figures from the 13th century as examples of the economics of the Eucharist, where the tales of the abundant Wineland the Good, where the grapes and the wheat grow wild, stand in strong contrast to the poor islands of the Arctic, where the wine of the altar is brewed with great difficulty from crowberries, if they are produced that year. Our dreams of Wineland the Good in the age of climate change will not be geographical. The abundant self-producing Eucharist dream will not mean conquest or utopic lands of abundance anymore. Instead, we might do well to recycle old traditions, look at them from fresh standpoints, which teach and which transform, make the most of what we have for the good of all, taste God in every lick, in lack and scarcity, work towards frugality and inclusion in the household of God, who comes to us as 200 grams of gruel. Thank you.